that I'm very happy too that I mean, you see it's in the middle of the night here and I'm on a boat. But I still wanted to talk to you because I was so happy that a book could actually make this link so far away and produce this questioning, I don't know, this new gathering that you have today. So that's nice, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Sibylle, I'm from Geheimagentur Collective. Geheimagentur Collective is an open collective that works together since roughly 2002. And yes, we do performance art. And I think that, I mean, if you think about theater, the foundation of the art form, theater really is a gathering. I mean, basically, theater, people come together in it, so it is basically a kind of gathering. And historically, if you think about the diverse origins of theater, it's always a form of a gathering that also has links to religious gatherings or political gatherings or judicial gatherings. And so, I think that performance art, in a way, I mean, traditionally, or the theater would be a lot about what happens on stage, but I think that performance art kind of turned the gaze around and looked at the gathering as such, as the action that people do in coming together, and how does it work. And so, performance art is a lot more about how everybody is coming together to change this. Are you all right? Well, I think that this is a very good question to answer it together. Because there are so many things, and I think that everybody can contribute something to this question, not just me. But I think that for us, what is in the center of this question is really the notion of the many, like how to come together, how to decide how to gather as the many. Because I think at the core of the real democracy movement obviously is a very radical kind of critique of how representation works and of how when we come together we establish certain relations between the many and the few to make the few speak for the many and decide for the many. And I think what changed in the real democracy movement is that there is a new awareness how this happens, how we let this happen in a gathering, that we establish this relation between the few and the many. And so all of the real democracy movements around the world had this in common, that they kind of, that they tried not to be represented by just a few people or by just a few slogans that they all stand behind, but that we try to come together as many, which is something different than as one. It's not so much about unity, but about diversity. And then, of course, on top of that, there are many very specific things that came together in the real democracy movements, like a new awareness for basic needs, which have to be in the center of a gathering. Like many gatherings have been arranged around kitchens or libraries or places where somehow people can actually live together temporarily. So, of course, the commons are also a very important new aspect of gathering in the real democracy movement. I mean, there are so many other things like the gestures that we now all know how to use, or the human microphone, or the blockades, right?
Yeah, and I think with the blockade,
being many, for us it's an ongoing process of research. It is not just the event of 2014, but it is something that we work on for many years in smaller groups and cooperations, and I think that these different terms like materiality and decision or timing and breaks and so on are all focuses of research of a few of the people who are involved from the very beginning. But also, if you think about a gathering from a performance point of view, these are all things that come to mind, like you can actually change the way a gathering uses a sound system, or you can experiment with how it might change a gathering if you actually change media, or if you change the timing, if you have different kinds of breaks or different kinds of I don't know. Yeah, I mean, these are different aspects how we can actually arrange gatherings in different ways.
So with that, how has the 2014 assembly been translated into this chart?
Yeah, as I said, the other being many has been a process over many years, and so about half of the book is consists of contributions of people who have done lots of research about it, who have written like PhDs about it, right, in this process. And the other half of the book is kind of coming out of the event itself. So people contributed who we didn't know before the event, who actually came to Hamburg to connect to this kind of research, and who then also contributed to the book. So for example, people like Orji Park or Brett Scott have been, a few of them, or Gigi Agriopoulos, Pancho Ramas, they are people who came to Hamburg and then later on contributed to the book. But it's not, the book is not documenting the event. A book is something so different from a gathering, you know.
And then with that, you have this idea of rehearsing the art of being many. How would this rehearsal of the assembly impact the gathering itself?
Yeah, I mean, it was always an interesting question to me. I mean, look at the gathering that you have tonight. Unfortunately, I cannot see the gatherings. Hello. Imagine how it would change the gathering if we would now all decide that it is just a rehearsal for a gathering that we will actually do in 2 hours. So how would that change the way we think about our being together right now? Or would it give us, I don't know, a freedom to experiment if we would think of it just as a rehearsal for the real thing, you know? So that's a little bit what was behind this idea. Of course, also it has something to do with a political assembly as such. In the real democracy movement is always something like a constituent assembly. It always tries to become an assembly where the many actually constitute themselves as the many, as a form of political power. But I think there is a balance between this aspect of the constituent assembly, which is something very serious and very moving, and this rehearsal that gives it a little bit more playfulness, you know. But actually it was quite a challenge. This concept of the rehearsal for the gathering in 2014 was quite a challenge because many people who came to the gathering with very pressing political questions were hesitating to go into this mode of experimentation or this mode of an as-if assembly because they feared that it might be something like a commodification of the political movement or spectacularization of it, you know, like making it a cultural event instead of a real political assembly. And so we had a lot of discussions about this, about when it makes sense to think of our gathering as a performance because it gives us the power to change it. And when actually it doesn't make sense to think about it as a performance because it's not about selling it as a performance or performing it very well, you know. So it has to be, it was an important discussion that we had.
Do we have any questions? Or if you're okay if we ask some questions from the group?
Of course.
If anyone has any questions, I'm welcome to come over here in front of the computer.
Well, I have a question. Maybe you could just have Raphael repeat it.
Yeah.
Just can you back up a tiny bit because I didn't read the book, so I don't know what you're meaning by the gathering that led to the book. Just what was the event that led to the writing of this book?
Yeah, so we have a question just about what was the event that led up to the writing of this book and what is this assembly that happened in 2014?
Yeah, so Geheimagentur, together with a PhD program that we have here in Hamburg that is called Assemblies and Participation, and together with a trans-European research group that was called Cities in Crisis, that was dominated by activists and theorists from Greece. Together, these three organizations invited people from real democracy movements, mainly from Europe, but also all around the world, and artists who have been working on performances which were concerned with new forms of gathering. So we invited these two groups to Hamburg in autumn 2014 to a big assembly that was called The Art of Being Many, to experiment with forms of coming together, with forms of collective decision making, with forms of documenting assemblies, with forms of movement, moving in the assembly, of using a different diversity in a gathering. It was a really big thing. It was 500 people were together for 4 days in Hamburg in one big assembly hall and around it. And yeah, that's what happened basically. And after that, we some of our findings, we put them in this book that Rafaela found on the internet and that caused this event, I think.
Can you ask her to describe if there is a difference or a conflict or a contrast between what they're calling the real democracy movement and electoral politics, since we have some elected politicians in the room. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so the question was, so we have some elected officials in the room here who will be speaking this evening as well. What is the difference between this real democracy movement that you are talking about, or the real people involved in these real democracy movements and an electoral democracy process?
I mean, what I refer to as the real democracy movement is basically the Occupy movement in all of its different, sometimes very different forms that it took in Southern Europe, you know. Obviously, what happened in Greece in 2011 on Sintaka Square, and what happened in Gezi Park, all of these movements together call themselves here in Europe real democracy movements. And basically, I mean, what might be more familiar to you is the Occupy movement, obviously, which is very close to, I mean, it's another variety of that. And what is different in these movements from an elected assemblies is basically that they come out of a frustration of given representative democracy that is somehow failing to represent the many, the majorities, the 99% as they call themselves in the Occupy movement. And it questions, therefore, if we shouldn't have new forms of constituent assemblies which kind of renew constitutional processes to make democracy work again.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question.
Why don't the many, the disenfranchised, unhappy folks get involved in the political system? Why don't they take their, rather than be outside and passive, if they showed up, they could have an impact?
Yeah, so the question was, why aren't these real democracy movements then getting into this elected body? Why are they not, I guess, participating in that?
Yeah, why don't they express their voice? And if there's so many of them, if it's the 99%, then they would change the world.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, maybe they will. I don't know. I can't speak for the Occupy movement and what happened to it and so on. You are much closer to this kind of movement than I am. Here in Europe, I can say that movement in Greece and in Turkey and also in the Balkan, all of these movements have been destroyed by police violence. Yeah. So many people still are in prison in Turkey who came from these movements. So it is not, that they can't really make it happen. It's actually that these movements were confronted with a lot of violence, and what we tried to do in 2014 was already a little bit after the fact. Many of these movements were going down in 2014 already. And what we as artists, I mean, I'm not mainly a political activist, I'm an artist, right? What we try to do with this gathering is to acknowledge these movements in the way they invented new forms of gatherings, in the way they actually produced knowledge about how to assemble and about alternative forms of governing in an assembly. And so we wanted to acknowledge this as a kind of knowledge production process that might not have had the political consequences that many people wished for, but still was an important process that brought knowledge and experience to people how to make things happen when we work together on a new level. And now we see in many places of Europe another movement coming. There is the Commons movement that learned from the real democracy movement, but it's not like doing spectacular big assemblies on the main squares, but people who are now very busy with organizing local kitchens, for example, for refugees. I'm sure you have heard that after the financial crisis, Europe is now dealing with a refugee crisis, that we all have to integrate many more people coming from Africa, coming from Syria, into our communities. And so the art of being many in these days is much more basic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thank you for taking the time this evening as well, or late night on your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Now into a roundtable conversation with Chris Hansen, Lisa Calderon, and Leslie Perez. So if you guys want to come up and join us.
I'm wondering if you want to just make sure they're not sitting right in this.
Yeah.
It's so hot. So maybe if you guys want to come over, we can see how we can move this table so that you don't have sun on you.
He's the candidate, right? He's not official.
That's right, I have to vote for myself in November. I have no
You
opposition.
have no opposition.
So you'll be running unopposed.